Well, to be designated professor by Professor Marty. I'll take that. I want to, before I talk, say something. And that is what a really great honor and privilege it is to be here again with you. And I want to acknowledge in a very personal way Sylvia and Dick for your fantastic creation of this tradition. And I really am proud to be part of it. I think, of course, of some of the great people who've preceded us here. Krister Stendahl, God rest in peace with him. David Hartman, the great David Hartman. Other tremendous figures in the life of belief have really given us something to live up to. And to be here today with Daniel, whose work in the center of Jerusalem is, in my view, the most important, committed interfaith center in the world. And what Daniel presides over there now is a rare sign of hope for all of us who care about religious conviction and religious renewal. And Vincent Cornell, a voice of firmly committed, deeply rooted, and ecumenical Islam, a very precious voice. And of course, Marty, who has changed the way over these years, not only the way America understands religion, but the way America understands itself. And I want to also acknowledge you. What a tremendous affirmation of the importance of this question it is that you have chosen to be here today. I'm personally honored and edified by your presence and hope to be worthy of it. So modernity and Christianity, I speak as a Roman Catholic Christian, and I'm going to be talking in a very particular way out of my own tradition today, in the conviction that the Roman Catholic experience in reckoning with modernity has relevance. It's up to others to decide what relevance, but it has, my conviction is it has relevance for other traditions, especially the traditions of the revealed religions represented at the table. So I am talking personally about my own experience of the Catholic Church's reckoning with modernity, which has in fact occurred, even though modernity is dated to the 17th, even 16th century by some, the Roman Catholic reckoning with modernity has occurred across the years of my lifetime. And so I am necessarily speaking personally. Oddly enough, although maybe not so oddly, the story of the Catholic Church and modernity begins with a condemnation. Whoa, that's unusual. Through the 19th century, for a variety of reasons, the Catholic Church found itself locked in a fierce struggle with many of the ideas that had been spawned by the Enlightenment and that were associated with what came to be called liberal democracy. Many of the propositions that were condemned by Pope Pius IX with his 1864 syllabus of errors made up what you might call a litany of modernism. Indeed, modernism was the Church's great enemy, so much so that even into my time, candidates for the Catholic priesthood took what was called the oath against modernism. So you see, I am an expert on what is wrong with modernity. But I am also an American, where liberal democracy flourished and where you could even say it was born. Modern ideas, even by 1864, were well established in the political culture of the United States of America. Religious pluralism, the separation of church and state, freedom of the press, a polity based on rights. Such modern notions were anathema in Rome. Therefore, it could seem a fulfillment of a long simmering hostility when, in his 1899 letter Testem Benevolentiae, Pope Leo XIII condemned the ultimate modern heresy, something called Americanism. Did you know that? Americanism is a heresy. The Pope's concern was not with how so-called democratic nations organized themselves, pluralism, secularism, rationalism, but his concern was with the way in which an ideology basic to such organization seemed to be taking root by then inside the church. So Catholics in America seemed to be in the very capital of modernity and modernism. And if Catholics were getting infected by modern ideas, that's what the Pope was standing against. Now, obviously, there were democratic movements in Europe, and from Marx to Nietzsche, there were European manifestations of modernism against which the Vatican set itself. The Enlightenment was a European phenomenon, after all. But the apparently more benign ideology of, say, the relativist William James or the pragmatist John Dewey could seem especially threatening because such New World ideas came wrapped in claims to virtue and even piety. Modernism in America went to church, unlike the modernism of Nietzsche, who proclaimed the death of God. Indeed, the much vaunted religious freedom of Americans was supposedly rooted in a corrective reaction to the violent excesses of the religious wars of Europe, when literally millions, mostly Christians, killed each other in the name of God. But celebrated American freedoms could disguise a radical subjectivity, which could in turn be seen as leading inevitably to the isolation of individuals and the destruction of community. Was secularism really an antidote to the religious violence of Europe? The secular religion, nationalism, would soon enough offer an answer to that. Both Daniel and Vincent, in their remarks this morning, emphasized how personal choice defined religious identity in the United States, which meant, finally, that private conscience took precedence over institutional authority. There's Americanism. Private conscience takes precedence over institutional authority. That is what Vincent called, citing a source, the beautiful dog. All of this in America was buttressed by belief in God, yes, which is why it was dangerous, but it was a deist God to whom the nation paid its lip service, a deity that was not a creator personally invested in creation. Remember the pointed question this morning about the personal character of God. The deist God, not personal, not the God of Jehovah, not the God of the Trinity, not the God of Jesus Christ. Cut off from an all-present and omniscient and intervening God with a rejection of ecclesiastical hierarchy, reflecting a rejection of the hierarchy of truth, American religion, from the point of view of Rome, was sham Christianity. And it was, by definition, a prelude to secularism. And there are authentic aspects in this critique to which we must still attend. And now, in 1899, there were American Catholics who, like carriers of an infection, wanted to bring this disorder into the Roman Catholic Church. Americanists. The condemnation of Americanism at the start of the 20th century, you may have noticed, did not end it. The American Catholics continued to take religious instruction from their broader culture. And though modernity has its dark side, Stalin, Hitler, Americans, including Catholics, were attuned to its promise. And I will say that its promise is more my subject this afternoon than its threat. But to many Catholics, its threat was vivid. By the middle of the 20th century, a bastion against Americanism had been erected in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at something called the St. Benedict Center near Harvard University. The chaplain of the center, we're in mid-20th century America now, the chaplain of the center was a Jesuit priest named Leonard Feeney. How many people know the name Leonard Feeney? A few, a good number actually. Well, I'm going to remind you of his story. And the rest of you, buckle your seatbelts. The genius of Leonard Feeney, anti-Americanism, was to settle on a single issue that could be wielded like a sword against modernity and against all that was undercutting the one true church. And that issue was extra ecclesia nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. Father Feeney's campaign, embodied in his highly publicized sermons, especially on the Boston Common, seemed to take special aim at Jews, whose rejection of Jesus as Messiah, not to mention the association of certain Jews with political and cultural revolution, made them the special enemy of Roman Catholicism. And this morning I indicated a bit of why that was so. But the threat of modernism, from Marx to Freud, could easily be made to seem a Jewish threat. Many people took offense at Feeney's intemperate and sweeping condemnations. But the truth is, Feeney was right in insisting that on the question of what was required for salvation, his was the traditional Orthodox position. He may have had leprosy in Vincent's image, but on this question, Feeney was the saint. He had popes and councils on his side going back 1,000 years, going back to the great St. Thomas Aquinas. No salvation outside the Catholic Church. His emphasis on salvation reinforced the Church's most potent mechanism for exercising authority, which was the terror of eternal damnation, which of course presumed a pre-modern cosmology of this world over against the next. Fueling Feeney was an implicit sense that the Americanist infection had taken hold within Catholicism after all, and not only on the fringes. In 1943, the year I was born, so I'm tracking actually the years of my life, the encyclical Mystici Corporis, the mystical body, had spoken of the Catholic Church as the mystical body to which others, non-Catholics, could belong, quote, by some kind of unconscious desire and longing. Aren't you non-Catholics glad to know that? You don't think you're a Catholic, but actually, you are. I've told you that, but you won't really believe it until you get to heaven and you find out that actually everybody in heaven is a Catholic. To people like Feeney, this encyclical that talked about unconscious desire and longing seemed like an important opening to amorphous notions of church membership. The shorthand for this was baptism by desire. You don't even know you're desiring it. And to Feeney, this kind of thinking could only confuse the faithful, and actually Feeney was right about this. Feeney demanded, therefore, a rigid adhering to a boundary, a singularity, in Daniel's word, which separated the saved from the damned, that his rhetoric fell on the ear of Americans, including many American Catholics, as uncivil and intolerant, only reconfirmed Feeney in its importance. So how does change in Catholic doctrine take place? I was actually raised to believe that change in Catholic doctrine was unthinkable. But I'm giving you the record of change in Catholic doctrine. How does change in Catholic doctrine take place? How did the Catholic Church make peace with what is good in modernity? And I would suggest, without hoping not to be presumptuous, that the lesson of how this happened has instruction for other religions of revelation as well. One of the Jews who had occasion to hear Feeney preach on the Boston Common, unlucky for Feeney, was a haberdasher by the name of Dick Pearlstein. His store, named for his father Louis, as it still is, still a grand men's clothing store on Newbury Street, the fanciest shopping street in Boston. The store was only a few blocks from Feeney's soapbox. Dick Pearlstein and his brother, as they took their lunchtime walks in the Boston Common, could not help but hear Feeney's diatribes as they strolled past. Pearlstein, unlucky for Feeney, was married to an MTA token taker whose name was Dolly, whose brother, as it happened, was the Archbishop of Boston. Richard Cushing. Oh, you've heard of Richard Cushing? I'm so glad to hear that, although it means on average we're a pretty old group here. Richard Cushing, the son of a blacksmith, was raised on the rough edge of South Boston. Like many of his kind, he crossed the threshold to a wider world at Boston College, from which he graduated in 1917. Cushing was an unpretentious man. He was famous for donning odd hats at public events, which was his way, actually, of putting people at ease. And I'd like to pause here to say that it's one of the joys of my life that when I was ordained a Catholic priest, I was commissioned to work for him as the Catholic chaplain at Boston University. Well, not exactly for him. I was actually working for Father John Kenny, who's over here. I'd like to introduce Father John Kenny, a Paulist father who's on the staff of the Catholic Cathedral here. And I want to acknowledge my debt to John Kenny and say that it was because of John Kenny that I learned how to negotiate the delicate task of being one of Cushing's priests. One priest in our day went to Cushing and said, "Your Eminence, I'm having a crisis of faith." And Cushing looked at him and said, "You don't have brains enough to have a crisis of faith." Go back to your parish and get to work. In Catholic Boston after the war, Cushing's position as Archbishop made him one of the most powerful people in the city. Although within church circles, his unpolished style and his rivalry with New York's Cardinal Francis Spellman kept him on the margins. Spellman was close to Pius XII. Spellman made sure that Cushing was not named a cardinal. Cushing's simplicity was embodied in his custom of almost always taking Sunday dinner at his sister Dolly's house. There, the Archbishop and Dick Pearlstein became intimate friends. He loved Dick Pearlstein. Dick Pearlstein's great-nephew told me that Cushing had quietly, secretly blessed their wedding. Cushing, when he heard of them from Dick, took Feeney's anti-Jewish diatribes as an insult to his own family. He ordered Feeney to stop preaching outside the church, "There is no salvation." Feeney refused, citing the tradition. In support of the Archbishop, the Jesuits transferred Feeney to Holy Cross College in Worcester, but he disobeyed to stay at St. Benedict's in Cambridge. In 1953, Cushing forced the issue, and he excommunicated Feeney. No salvation outside the church was not to be preached in Boston. Despite an unbroken contrary insistence that ran from Thomas Aquinas to Pope Pius IX, the Vatican upheld Cushing's excommunication, stunning Feeney and the whole Catholic world. I was a 10-year-old attending church and going to school at St. Mary's Parish in Alexandria, Virginia, and the Monsignor and the sisters spoke of nothing else. They upheld the excommunication. I went home to my mother and said, they excommunicated a priest for teaching no salvation outside the church. My mother said, I know. I said, I thought that's what we believed. She said, it was. I said, what do we believe now? And she said, we believe live and let live. My mother was an Americanist. My own home had been infected with modernity. And Cushing himself, without claiming it, of course, was an Americanist. And here's the point. Reversing the usual order of the tradition, he had moved from an ethical insight to a theological conclusion. An ethical insight led him to a theological conclusion. His starting point was not revelation, not the tradition, not the magisterium, not the teaching of the church. His starting point was his own experience. I love Dick Pearlstein, therefore God must love Dick Pearlstein too. It's that simple. He had come to this position because of the interreligious elbow rubbing that is endemic to America. His theological conviction about Jewish eligibility for salvation came, that is, from his personal knowledge of a single Jew. Modernity. This movement of Cushing's repeats what had happened in the Galileo affair, which is often marked as the beginning of modernity. When the church engaged Galileo as the primordial conflict with what would eventually be known as the Enlightenment. Galileo, what did he do? He prized experience over ideology, observation over theory. If the earth moves, he asserted, then the Psalms, which say it does not, cannot be read as literally true. The Enlightenment question, how do I know that I exist, found an Enlightenment answer, not because God tells me, but because I experience myself asking the question. I think, therefore I am. Modernity. Not revelation from God, but I think, therefore I am. The primacy of the self as a center of experience and knowledge emerged soon enough as the ground of democracy, a polity which recognizes every self as of ultimate value. Modernity. I think, therefore I am. The self as an ultimate value, the ground of democracy, therefore. If the self is an ultimate value, no more organizing society by ranks of selfhood, with some being defined as better than others. This primacy of the self was the core affirmation of the founding of this country. All men are created equal. And it is the essence of what we mean by modernity. I told you I was more interested in the promise than the threat. In America, regard for the individual and for individual rights led to a system of balancing interests which sought to protect each one while enabling the whole community to thrive, looking for a new balance, e pluribus unum. The Constitution is an ingenious system of balancing conflicting interests in a larger unity, a commonwealth which takes differences for granted, even religious differences. Diversity and pluralism are of the essence of such a system, which leads to that elbow rubbing of like person with unlike person. You rub elbows with people who aren't like you, and who don't think the way you think, and who don't believe what you believe. And when persons of differing values and convictions enter into such social intimacy, whether through the neighborhood, the workplace, or as in Cushing's case, the mixed marriage, values and convictions exist in a different light. Absolute assumptions come into question. One person's truth claims submit to another person's truth claims. This dynamic is essential to America, and it set apart America early on from the old world, where political boundaries kept religious absolutes apart. But here, the boundaries are to be crossed, and so therefore can the old ways of looking at the truth. This dynamic is essential to America, which is why rigidly fundamentalist ideologues, like Osama bin Laden, to take the most obvious, hate America. The Catholic who grasped this American phenomenon and its meaning for the Catholic Church, and on whom Cushing depended for advice, was the Jesuit John Courtney Murray. His own progression tracks the change. Before World War II, Murray himself argued for no salvation outside the church. But the trauma of the war and the experience of the Holocaust, together with the revolutionary social consequences that followed the war, interfaith cooperation among religions, the GI Bill of Rights that brought American Catholics more fully into the national mainstream and so on, all of that in that pivotal decade changed John Courtney Murray. He grasped that American constitutional democracy, instead of the selfish solipsism that the Vatican warned of, was a form of regulated mutuality. There was no necessary conflict between the individual and the community, even in a system that granted a certain primacy to the individual. The church, that is, did not have to fear Americanism. The primary value is defined as conscience. In a polity that exists to protect the freedom of conscience of individuals, within it, state power must be removed from the advocacy or even sponsorship of any particular mode of conscience. The magistrate must be the protector of the inner life of every citizen. The magistrate, therefore, must be religiously neutral. Therefore, and here is the core ingenious American idea, the separation of church and state. Established religion, the religion of the state, by definition, coerces the conscience of the citizen. Religious liberty, and Murray argued authentic religion, requires the separation of church and state, that Catholicism could thus take instruction from Thomas Jefferson was powerfully symbolized by the title of Murray's most famous and influential work, which was, "We Hold These Truths." Around the time that Father Feeney was being excommunicated, Father Murray, you won't be surprised, was being silenced by the Vatican. Unlike Feeney, whose disobedience ironically qualified him, despite himself, as a crypto-Americanist, somebody whose commitment to the tradition only went as deep as his own opinion, unlike Feeney, Murray obeyed. That Feeney and Murray, who represented opposite impulses, could both be disapproved by the Vatican at the same time, shows that the church was in a powerful argument with itself. That argument was brought to a climactic resolution at the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, when at long last the Roman Catholic Church began to make its peace, not only with the democratic idea, but with modernity. The oath against modernism was dropped. Not before they actually required me to take it, unfortunately. I said to the priest, we were in the sacristy of the chapel, the priest whose job it was to require me to say this oath. But, you know, I just spent the last 5 years learning all this stuff. And now I'm supposed to swear that I don't believe any of it? And he said, yeah, but, you know. Nobody, you know. And how do you know what it says anyway? Because it's in Latin. So on the strength of that, unclear about what it said. Cardinal Cushing, and by the way, as Archbishop of Boston, Cushing was named to the College of Cardinals as one of the first things done by Pope John XXIII when he became Pope in 1958. The peasant pope recognized Cushing as a soul brother. Cardinal Cushing was at that council with John Courtney Murray as his advisor, and he made 3 notable interventions or major speeches at the council, each reflecting the Americanist spirit. The first was an early plea to have the Latin proceedings translated. I have to explain. It's St. Peter's Basilica, you got, 2,500, 3,000 bishops, all in bishops' gear, sitting on bleachers put in the largest church in the world, up and down the side of St. Peter's Basilica. The cardinals have begun their deliberation, the bishops, and it's in Latin, which is, of course, one of the techniques that the Italian-based conservative curia, as they were called, were using to control the proceedings. And at a certain point, the second or third day, Cardinal Cushing raised his hand, and I don't know that he actually said this on the floor of the council, but he certainly said it in public. He said, "I don't know about the rest of you fellows, but this might as well be Eskimo to me." And he proposed that they adopt a United Nations-style simultaneous translation system that he would pay for. And there was a vote. It was actually the first vote, and the vote was resoundingly against Cushing's proposal. A triumph for the conservative curia. They were in charge. And of course, they had the advantage because as Italians, they only pretended to speak Latin, and they were actually, and so it looked like that was going to be the way the council went. It didn't happen for a number of important reasons. I would argue the most important of which, again, experience over doctrine, was, guess what else happened that week? The Cuban Missile Crisis. And the bishops, like the rest of the world, sat on the edge of their benches waiting for the end of the world to take place. And by the end of that week, they understood in a way they hadn't at the beginning of the week that what the world was needing was a Roman Catholic Church that was renewed and reformed enough to be relevant to the crisis facing the human race, which was John the 23rd's message to them and to President Kennedy and to Nikita Khrushchev. And his quiet diplomacy was something the bishops were quite aware of that week. And at the end of that week, the first document put before the Council Fathers was the declaration on the liturgy. And the great question that had been burning up Catholics for a decade was, will they put the language of the liturgy into the vernacular, into our own language, or will it stay in Latin? And the declaration on the liturgy, same issue, Latin, made no mention of changing the language. It was a pious nosegay celebrating the way in which the Blessed Virgin Mary operates through the Mass. And the Curia expected the bishops to rubber stamp this declaration, and one by one they stood up to oppose it. And when the vote came, it was overwhelmingly against it. And when Cardinal Ottaviani, the head of the Curia, stood up to protest, he broke his own procedural rule and spoke too long, and his microphone was shut off, and the bishops applauded. And Pope John, watching on closed-circuit television, turned to the person sitting next to him and said, "Now my council begins." And the language of the medieval church was rejected in favor of modern language, modernity. Modernity was born in the vernacular with Luther, with Tyndale, and the growth of mass literacy. When the individual had access to the sacred language, modern consciousness began. Cushing's impulse was victorious then, when the Mass was put into the vernacular. Cushing's second intervention was a first affirmation of the Council Declaration on the Jewish people, Nostra Aetate. Thinking of his own brother-in-law, Cushing said, "The Jews are the blood brothers of Christ." He was the most fervent defender of Nostra Aetate against its conservative opponents. Experience over dogma. If that is the essence of the religious meaning of modernity, then here we have the heart of the Catholic change. For it was the experience of the Holocaust that made Catholic leaders see the need for doctrinal change, the most revolutionary change in the history of Roman Catholicism. Nostra Aetate, saying two things. One, you may no longer ever preach that the Jews are Christ killers, despite the fact that the texts of the New Testament say otherwise. And two, the covenant God has made with the people Israel is full and complete and permanent. You don't have to go to God through Jesus. A revolutionary affirmation that the church is still grappling with in its theology and in its teaching. Experience over dogma. And the third intervention of Cushing's was a defense of religious liberty during the debate on the Declaration Dignitatis Humanae, on the dignity of the human person. The Catholic Church, Cushing said, should become the champion of liberty, of human liberty, of civil liberty, and especially of liberty in matters of religion. You are free to believe what you want to believe. What Cushing began during the confrontation with Feeney was brought to a completion, or a beginning of a completion, at the council. Perhaps the most dramatic shift in Catholic meaning, if also the most unofficial, was the move away from the ancient and overriding emphasis on salvation and its equivalent, damnation. The God of my youth was a damning God, and that God has been left behind in the Catholic tradition. Feeney's preaching had taken the primacy of hell as a starting point, but that primacy was now rejected. You weren't put here to be afraid. As quickly as Latin disappeared from the liturgy, the dread of hell disappeared from the center of Catholic preoccupation. The council, that is, in the spirit of Pope John XXIII, and in a return to the spirit of the Gospels, implicitly replaced a damning God with a loving God. For us, this is the gift of a modern church. And nothing symbolizes the Catholic reversal that occurred at the council more powerfully than the fact that the silenced John Courtney Murray was brought to Rome to serve as the principal author of Dignitatis Humanae. The Catholic Church affirmed at last that religious freedom is a basic human right possessed by all. The primacy of conscience, the necessity of religious pluralism, the dignity of the human person, the obligation of government to protect these values, and the corollary separation of church and state. All of this was solemnly accepted by the fathers of the Vatican Council. But the long journey away from Testem Benevolentiae was not quite complete. What the Council Fathers did not fully comprehend was that it was impossible to make affirmations of basic principles of religious freedom for human beings generally without those principles applying in particular to Catholic persons. It was one thing for church authority to honor the foundational ideas of modernity, rationality, democracy outside the church. But what about democracy inside the church? Hello? It was another thing altogether to see how those ideas apply here. The primacy of conscience, for example. Once the idea that each individual, even acknowledging the obligation to take authoritative teaching seriously, has the right and duty to arrive at moral choices on his or her own terms, then Catholic attitudes toward authority inevitably changed. Experience over dogma. This shift was soon apparent, for example, the most obvious one, in the way in which the Catholic people responded to Rome's reiteration of the condemnation of birth control. The ideas that took root and then flourished in America have, across recent decades, taken flight. The democratic ideal has been embraced in cultures and countries that once defined themselves against it. The dark side of modernity, yes, where the human race almost lost its way in the 20th century, has been brightened especially among peoples who were most imprisoned, and it is far from finished for them. The same is true in a special way in the Roman Catholic Church, unfinished. Loyal Catholics coming to America found their faith reinforced, not undercut, by a modern experience of American democratic principles. We know from our sacred texts, for example, that, as the letter of John says, no one has ever seen God, but it is the ethos of religious pluralism that took hold in America that fully honors the universal impossibility of direct knowledge of God. No one has direct knowledge of God. Such holy ignorance must lead to modesty about one's own doctrinal claims and to respect for the religious claims of others. Such modesty and respect are the grounds of democracy. In America, intimately encountering the sincerely held beliefs of those who are different, Catholics have learned to see their own beliefs in a broader context. Tolerance for the beliefs of the other led inexorably to a revising of one's own belief. That's the point of interreligious dialogue. Encountering the beliefs of the other requires a change in my beliefs. Tolerance for the beliefs of the other leads inevitably to revising one's own faith. Therefore, the Catholic Church went from defining itself with Pope Leo XIII as a perfect society to defining itself with Vatican II as a pilgrim people. We are not possessors of the truth. We are pilgrims on the way to the truth. In nothing has such modern revision been more dramatic than in the Church's rediscovery of the Jesus of the Gospels, who himself preached only such a God. On the way to God is what we mean by on the way to the truth. Our idea of God changed through all of this. The God beyond God, who while present in mystery is beyond us all. God is greater than religion, as Rabbi Heschel said. There is no God but God is the most eloquent statement of this faith I know. It would be anachronistic, of course, to find anything like what we call modernity in the life and preaching of Jesus. But on the other hand, it is impossible to dismiss the relevance of the example of Jesus for what we are trying to say here, for the ongoing democratic, critical, modern renewal of belief, and in my case, of the church. Jesus was never coercive. Jesus never compelled. He chose service over lordship. He affirmed the dignity of every person he met. He treated women as equals. He saw the indwelling spirit in each individual, and he proposed respectful mutuality as the reliable sign of God's presence in the Jew, of God's presence in the world, and he did all of this as a Jew. The Catholic Church is on the way to more fully embodying in all of what it does and believes what it sees in this Jesus. He is the church's meaning and its measure, and we see him clearly in modernity, as clearly as we ever did in the tradition. No one has ever seen God, John said. If we love one another, God abides in us, and God's love in us is perfect. Thank you.